Good morning, good afternoon, and I'm so happy to be here. And I want to begin by acknowledging Treaty 6 land that we are all occupying, and we are all treaty people. I want to start my presentation. I want to tell you a story because I come from a long line of storytellers, artists, historians, and other ne'er-do-wells. And my story, I will begin from the mid-70s, where I was teaching up at South End Reindeer Lake, Meadow Lake in the northern part of this province. And what I saw there was immense beauty amongst immense suffering. And as a young Native woman at that time, a Cree, and they always say behind every tree is a Cree. So if you doubt that, check behind the tree, the trees. I was teaching in these northern communities amongst all of this amazing beauty and pain. And as a young woman, I thought, like, what is the cause of this? What is the source of the pain? And some of you will read newspapers and understand what I'm talking about. One of the previous speakers spoke about prisons being full of our people. So up at South End Reindeer, I had this book called Fanshen, which is the history of a revolution in a Chinese village. I thought, well, that speaks to me. So I started reading it, and I started getting so inspired by the power of people to create delightful social change. But then I would look out in my backyard and I would see homeless children. I would see hunger. I would see poverty amidst this most amazing forested communities. I said, there must be more to life than this. So I booked a one-way ticket to Latin America. It was the late 70s, and if any of you are familiar with Indigenous history and revolution, it was the time of major social reconstruction, but also genocide, and I was not ready for that. So I traveled from Mexico to Ecuador with a backpack, a young Native woman. And it was a turning point for this old soul's life. It was a major transformation. And what I saw there was the story of South End Reindeer on steroids. I saw and I understood and I visited Indigenous communities that still had machete knife wounds in the doors, where thousands and thousands and thousands of Indians had been massacred. It was both humbling and horrifying. I came back, I flew from Ecuador. I managed to get through 6 countries in 6 months. I had purchased a return ticket from Brazil, thinking, not even knowing the immensity of the lands of the region. I got as far as Ecuador. After my 6 months there, I flew from Guayaquil, Ecuador, to an airport in Florida. And I didn't realize at the time that I had this disease dormant in me from the water quality down there. I was pushing my eggs on a plastic plate around with my plastic fork in the airport in Florida, remembering the stories of genocide of my people, the people who looked like me, the people with the black hair, the dark skin, the unreported history, the unwritten history for the most part. I came back to Canada with this burst of energy and knowledge and just wanting to talk about what I had seen and how impacted I was, and discovering bodies in the street killed over land rights of Indigenous peoples. And I came back here and I wanted to tell my story. And I started by talking to my own people and by other people, and they said, "What the hell are you talking about? This is Canada." Oh yeah, right, this is Canada. So it was at that time when I started discovering the writers such as Frantz Fanon. How many have heard of Frantz Fanon? Albert Memmi. How many have heard of Albert Memmi? Oh, I forgot, this is a university. We don't cover this kind of literature. Resistant literature is what helped me through those times. The writings of Angela Davis. How many have heard of Angela Davis? We're getting warm. And numerous other authors of color that helped me take myself from despair to knowledge, to understand within a global context what was happening to my people. When I came back here, the conditions of social inequalities did not disappear, But what I discovered was my history was not being reported in institutes of higher learning. The Department of Native Studies was only just established in the mid-'80s here on campus. The history books are largely of kings and queens' history, written predominantly by white males. And I have many good white males in my family. Many of my colleagues, many of my students. So I'm not dissing anybody. But the point that I am making is that there is a savage history of Canada that has not been told. And it's not about savages, contrary to what history has called us when I was a little girl growing up. But the savage history of residential schools, the savage history of racism, of isolation, of outstanding land claims, of what's the word I'm looking for? Discommunities, maybe. Disappeared voices, family violence, creation of billionaires and millionaires off the backs of Indigenous peoples. All of that. Untold history. But there's also a wonderful frame of reference from which Indigenous people spring. And so it wasn't the dream for me to do a doctorate degree, but traveling throughout the globe continued even after the 70s. And there I discovered massive wealths of knowledge about Indigenous knowledge systems throughout South Africa, the South Pacific, Canada, the Hawaiian Islands, Vanuatu, India. And I've been truly blessed to be able to experience this knowledge and to try, as a university professor and learner, because we are all learners, to transform the academy, to transform learning bases, knowledge bases, to color code it. And it's been a tremendous journey. So in 2007, I completed a document called Pamatsuin. And Pamatsuin is simply the Cree word for the good life. And throughout this story is stories of Indigenous values around relationships. We are all related. We all breathe the same air. We depend on the same land. We require the same amount of love and support. Without love, without support, there is nothing. And I have been fortunate to have that in my life through family, through friends, through all of you being here, sharing our stage. Service to humanity is the primary value in Indigenous cultures. And sometimes it's very hard to balance that with the goals of higher learning, where getting ahead is the most important value and goal in higher learning, getting ahead, being better than the next guy, producing a 98% GPA. You know what I'm talking about. So we have a lot of work as Indigenous peoples, peoples of color, marginalized peoples, because I believe that's where the clarity of vision comes from. Not from the podium, not from the microphone, but from the margins. And speaker after speaker will speak to that. So over the past 10 years, I've been collecting those stories because our culture is an oral culture. And again, it wasn't my intention to write a book or to publish these stories, but these were powerful stories from the margins. And the reason I got inspired to actually produce a text was the stories of the resilience of women, particularly Indigenous women. And it was through my work at the university where I heard those voices of women that were striving through unbelievable challenges to survive, and not only to survive, but to flourish. So last night I was watching the NDP annual meeting, conference, and I was so inspired by the voice of Olivia Chow when speaking about her deceased husband. I was inspired once again to do the right thing and to speak hope to truth, because truth is not always hopeful. In fact, truth is sometimes the least hopeful when you are a brown woman, an indigenous woman in a predominantly white institution, in a predominantly white world. And she spoke about her husband, her deceased husband, Jack Layton, who I worked with and gained a lot of inspiration from, really put values back in the place. And, you know, you take this knowledge and you move it forward to 2012, and you look at the world that we have created for the little ones. I'm now a grandmother. I have a 16-month-old little baby girl. Her mother's a teacher in the inner city. Her mother comes home to me with stories of disenfranchised youth, similar to the stories that Nancy was telling. And I think, you know, US scientists tell us we have lost 500 species since 200 years. I don't have to tell you the impact that's going to have down the road. And that's only in the US, 500 species in the US. So globally, it's thousands of species daily. Every one of us in this room, in our classroom, in our churches, in the roads, everywhere, we need to be engaged in a most joyful but informed way about each other's realities. We need to smash the concept of other. That's kind of a violent term, I think, but you get my drift. And this is a wonderful place to begin that conversation. Finally, I have 5 minutes left. I am privileged to teach hundreds of students a year. I'm privileged because I see hope in the youth. Cody Dill, Jay Custer, Nancy Van Stuyvendale, these are young people that are making a difference, and I am so privileged to work with all of you. What was it, Sir, the gentleman that spoke by telecast? He said that we may not live to see the future, much into the future, but these little ones, these young ones do. So it's incumbent upon all of us to speak our truths, to get to know each other. And again, I go back to my own culture of relationships. Relationality is the most important value in our culture. It's not about having a Ph.D. It's about rediscovering the values that once built strong nations. It's about understanding the many forms of oppression and genocide that has taken place. You see, Canada has a long history of denying the Holocaust that happened to Indigenous peoples, that continues to happen today. We can go to any center of the town here and see that. But also within that, we see great hope, great inspiration. And we must cling to that, because the world needs no more billionaires, no more trillionaires, no more $3.7 trillion spent per year on wars. No more. No more toxic dump sites in Indigenous communities. None. Development from the ground up, utilizing every source we have, human source. We need that desperately today. Tupac, an Indigenous warrior from Latin America, hundreds of years ago, before he was torn limb from limb, literally, the Spaniards tied up each limb and tore him limb from limb. And his dying words were, "You may kill me, but I will come back in the millions." And those are the historians that I am inspired by. These are the venues that give me life and give me hope. And I thank you for being part of our process.